Hector Reyes managed a California farm for 31 years. He knew every acre, every drainage pattern, every decision that made the premium fruit worth $40,000 more per year than the farm next door. When the owner died, the farm passed to the owner's children. Hector's name was not in the will. It couldn't be, because Hector didn't legally exist on the property where he had spent his entire adult life. The children hired a licensed farm manager, a professional, with credentials and a clean truck and industry-standard systems. In March, during the most critical week of the growing season, the new manager cut the irrigation on the wrong block. Hector saw the soil color at 6 in the morning and knew exactly what was happening. He had two choices: follow the chain of command and watch 30 years of work begin to die, or water the field himself and deal with the consequences. He watered the field. What happened next would force everyone on that farm to answer a question no one had asked out loud yet. Who actually built this place? Hector Reyes had been on the Alderman farm for 31 years. He arrived in the spring of 1993, 22 years old. From Oaxaca, he came the way men came in those years. Through a network of cousins and acquaintances, through a coyote in Nogales, through 3 days in a truck bed before being dropped at the edge of a county road in the San Joaquin Valley, with a phone number written on a piece of paper. He called the number. A man answered in Spanish and told him where to go. He went. The farm was 480 acres of strawberries and table grapes outside of Tulare, California. The owner was a man named Lawrence Alderman, 60 years old when Hector arrived. He ran the operation with his wife Doris, and in some years 1 or 2 seasonal helpers who came and went. Lawrence Alderman was not a particularly warm man. He was direct, fair, consistent. He paid what he said he would pay. He never shorted anyone. He never changed the terms after they were set. In the world Hector was entering, these qualities were not common. He stayed. He stayed that first season because the work was steady and Lawrence was honest. He stayed the second because he had learned the land, and leaving meant starting over. He stayed the third because Doris Alderman, who was a kinder person than her husband and had taken a practical interest in Hector's welfare, had helped him enroll in the adult English program at the community college in Tulare on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He drove the farm truck to class and drove it back and was up at 5 the next morning. He stayed because leaving kept getting harder. By the 5th year, he was the farm's primary irrigator. He understood the water system better than Lawrence did, which was not a boast. It was the result of being present with it every day while Lawrence managed the buyers, the equipment dealers, the bank. By the 8th year, he was managing a crew of 6 during harvest. By the 12th year, he was making decisions that Lawrence signed off on, but understood were Hector's decisions. A trust built in increments too small to identify individually but unmistakable by year 12. Lawrence never said this directly. He said things like, "You handle the irrigation scheduling this week. I've got the co-op meeting." He said things in the way of men who communicate trust without the vocabulary for it. Hector built a life circumscribed in ways that other people's lives were not. He could not open a bank account under his own name without risk. He could not get a driver's license, so he drove the county roads between the farm and the college and the grocery store in Tulare, with a care that was necessity rather than caution. Being stopped for anything was a different category of event for him than it was for Lawrence Alderman or any of the Anglo farmers in the valley. He could not access programs that other farm workers could access. He could not complain to any authority about anything without that complaint becoming a problem larger than whatever he was complaining about. These were not unique circumstances. They were common ones. the circumstances that made the San Joaquin Valley's agricultural economy function the way it functioned. What Hector had, and what the circumstances could not take from him, was the farm. Not legally, never legally, but in the way that people have things because they know them completely. He knew the South Block's drainage pattern and why it had improved in the 90s after he convinced Lawrence to try cover cropping in the row middles. He knew the irrigation schedule by feel, not by the timer on the system, but by the look of the soil and the temperature of the air and the hour of the morning. He knew which sections of the vineyard produced fruit worth premium pricing, and which sections would never get there, and why and what it would take to close the gap. He knew things that were not written down anywhere. Lawrence Alderman died in October of 2023. He died the way men who have worked outdoors their whole lives sometimes die, suddenly, without the extended decline that gives time for conversations that have been put off too long. Heart attack in the equipment shed on a Tuesday afternoon, gone before the ambulance arrived. He was 90 years old. He had been slowing down for years, doing less physical work, coming out in the mornings to walk the rows and then going back inside, letting Hector run the operation in all but name. Doris had died 4 years earlier. Their son Carl lived in Sacramento, commercial insurance, had been to the farm over 22 years, perhaps a dozen times. Their daughter Patricia lived in Portland, had been perhaps 8 times. She had stronger opinions about the farm than Carl, and less information to support them. Hector learned about Lawrence's death from Elena, the wife of one of the harvest crew workers, who had heard it from someone at the grocery store in Tulare. Lawrence had not called him. There was no call to make. But the information arrived the way. Information about the Alderman farm always arrived to the people who worked it, through a channel that did not include official notification. He went to the farm the next morning at his usual time. He did not know what else to do. Carl arrived on Thursday. Patricia arrived on Friday. Rental cars from the Fresno airport. They parked at the farmhouse and looked at the place with the look of people who have been told their whole lives that something belongs to their family and are now confronting what that means in practical terms. Carl was 54, compact, organized legal pad in hand. Patricia was 51, taller than her brother, with her mother's directness and her father's skepticism. She had brought nothing visible but was clearly running calculations she had started before she arrived. Hector met them at the farmhouse. He had been working the morning irrigation, and he came in from the field in his boots and his work shirt. He introduced himself to Carl, who he had met twice in 31 years, and to Patricia, who he had met once. Carl shook his hand and said, "You must be Hector." Patricia said, "You've been here a long time." They went inside. Hector sat at the kitchen table that he had sat at hundreds of times with Lawrence. Carl opened the legal pad. Patricia stood near the window. "We need to understand the current operations," Carl said. "Staffing, contracts, equipment condition." Hector told him. The 4 full-time workers in the labor housing on the east side. The harvest crew contracts, verbal but honored by the same families for 8 years. The equipment, 2 tractors, the irrigation pump, the refrigerated storage unit that needed a new compressor before the next harvest. The open order from the co-op for the table grape harvest in April. The relationship with the Fresno buyer who had been purchasing premium fruit above market for 6 years because of quality and reliability of supply. Carl wrote on the legal pad. Patricia asked about the labor housing, whether the workers had formal lease agreements. Hector said they did not. She wrote something on her phone. After an hour, Carl said, "We'll need time to assess before making decisions about the farm's future." Hector said he understood. "In the meantime," Carl said, "can you keep things running?" "Yes," Hector said. He went back out to the farm. He finished the morning irrigation. He checked the cover crop in the south block. He repaired a section of trellis wire that had been on his list for 2 weeks. He did the work the farm needed. That evening he sat in his kitchen and thought about what keeping things running meant when the people asking you to do it had never done it and did not understand what it required. He had known this day was coming for years. Lawrence had not been careless about the farm's future, exactly. He had been avoidant of it. He had made a will. The farm would pass to Carl and Patricia equally. Standard estate procedure. He had not written anything about the operations management, about the knowledge Hector carried, about what would be lost if Hector left, or what would happen to the farm if decisions were made by people who had not spent 31 years understanding it. He had not done this because it was painful, also because he had assumed, in the way of people who avoid thinking about something, that it would work out. What he had not accounted for was that Hector had no legal standing to be anywhere. The will was read 3 weeks later. Hector was not mentioned in it. This was not a surprise. There was no legal mechanism by which Lawrence could have provided for Hector. Without complications, he had lacked the sophistication or the will to navigate. What Hector had was 31 years of knowledge about a piece of land and no document in the world that acknowledged that fact. Carl and Patricia hired an agricultural management consultant named Derek Foss from Fresno 2 weeks after the reading. He arrived on a Monday morning and walked the property with a clipboard and asked Hector questions for 4 hours. The questions were good. Derek Foss knew what he was asking. He wrote down everything Hector said with the speed of someone transcribing rather than learning. That was the difference. 2 weeks later, Carl and Patricia came back for a meeting. Derek Foss presented a 17-page report with charts and appendices. The operational recommendations included hiring a licensed farm manager, installing a computerized irrigation management system, formalizing harvest crew contracts, and transitioning the table grape operation toward higher yield varieties based on current market data. None of the recommendations mentioned Hector. He was referenced as current operational staff Fife, with extensive institutional knowledge of the property. The recommendations assumed the institutional knowledge could be extracted through the kind of interview Derek Foss had conducted and deposited into whoever took over. That was not how institutional knowledge worked. Hector had watched Derek Foss write down answers to questions for 4 hours. He had given accurate and complete answers. And he knew, reading the report, that Derek Foss had recorded the answers without recording the web of understanding that connected them. He had recorded that the south block was cover-cropped, but not the 20-year history of soil chemistry that explained why the cover crop selection had changed 3 times and what each change had produced. He had recorded the irrigation schedule, but not the reading of the land the schedule was built on top of. He had recorded the relationship with the Fresno buyer, but not the 3 years of difficult harvests that had built the trust that made the relationship worth what it was worth. The knowledge that was not written down was not extractable by interview. He folded the report and put it in the glove compartment of his truck and drove home. He called a man named Roberto Vega the next morning. Roberto had been in the valley for 25 years from Michoacán, a community liaison at the California Rural Legal Assistance Office in Visalia. Practical, unsentimental, encyclopedic knowledge of both the law and its limits. He had helped Hector navigate several situations over the years. Roberto listened to what Hector told him. He was quiet for a moment. "You want to stay on the farm," he said. "I want the farm to be okay," Hector said. "Those are the same thing," Roberto said. "You know that." Hector was quiet. They are the same thing, Roberto said again, more gently. What do you need? What Hector needed, Roberto explained, was a formal employment agreement, a written contract, a defined position, a compensation structure that appeared on paper. It would not address the underlying situation, but it would create a documented relationship that gave Hector standing to be present and to be heard when decisions were made. It would also create documentation, and documentation, Roberto said, was the beginning of every legitimate claim. Hector agreed. Roberto began drafting. Meanwhile, Carl and Patricia moved quickly. The licensed farm manager they brought in was named Greg Tanner, 38, Anglo. He had managed a 300-acre almond operation in Stanislaus County for 4 years. A professional manner, Farm Bureau membership, a truck that was clean in a way that farm trucks were not clean when they were actually being used for farm work. He arrived in February, and Hector showed him around. Greg Tanner asked good questions. He was not incompetent. He was probably good at managing an almond operation in Stanislaus County, with established systems and predictable inputs, and a soil type he had spent 4 years learning. He was not good at what he was being asked to do now, which was manage a table grape and strawberry operation in Tulare County, with the specific history and water characteristics and market relationships that 480 alderman acres had accumulated over 60 years. He did not know this about himself. That was the problem. The first conflict was about the irrigation. In March, during the critical period before bud break, Greg Tanner adjusted the irrigation schedule based on evapotranspiration data from the CIMIS weather station network. The industry standard, technically accurate for average conditions in the valley. The South Block was not average conditions. The South Block had a subsurface drainage pattern that caused it to shed moisture faster than the CIMIS data would predict. Hector had understood this for 20 years. When the irrigation was cut back based on the CIMIS recommendation, the South Block got dry. Dry in March, before bud break, meant vine stress. Vine stress at bud break meant reduced set and reduced yield at harvest. Hector saw the soil color in the South Block on a Thursday morning and knew immediately. He went to Greg Tanner and explained. He was specific, he was clear, he was correct. Greg Tanner listened with the attentiveness of a professional man receiving information from a person he had placed in a specific category. He said he appreciated the input. He said he would look at the data. He said CIMIS was the industry standard for a reason. Hector went back to the South Block. He watered it himself, off schedule, using the manual override on the pump that he had installed 12 years ago for exactly this situation. He documented what he did in his own log, the one he had been keeping since Lawrence stopped being able to track things in the mid-2010s. Greg Tanner found out the next morning. He said, "I need you to clear irrigation changes with me before you make them." Hector said yes. He did not say, "If I had cleared it with you, the South Block would have stressed." He did not say, "The South Block will set properly this year because I ignored your schedule." He said yes and went back to work. Carl found out through Greg Tanner's weekly update. He called Hector. "You adjusted the irrigation without authorization." Hector explained the drainage issue, the historical pattern, what would have happened without the adjustment. Carl was quiet for a moment. "I understand," he said, "but we need a clear chain of command. Greg is the farm manager. Changes need to go through him." "Yes," Hector said. "I appreciate that you know this land," Carl said, "but we need a system that can function without depending on any one person's judgment." Hector held the phone. He thought about what he wanted to say, which was that a system not depending on any one person's judgment was exactly what this farm was not, and could not be without years of deliberate knowledge transfer. He did not say this, he said, "I understand. He went back to the South Block. Carl and Patricia arrived for a site visit in April. They brought Greg Tanner and a lawyer named Susan Park and a woman named Judith from the consultant firm. They walked the property for 2 hours. Hector was present for part of it. At one point, Patricia stopped in the premium vineyard block, the one the Fresno buyer had been paying above market for 6 years, and looked at the trellising and the vine spacing and the soil. "Hector, this is the high-value block?" He said yes. She said, "What makes it higher value?" He explained, "A slightly elevated position giving better air drainage and reducing late frost risk to early buds. A soil profile running deeper in this section because of an ancient stream beneath it. Vine age now over 25 years in this block, producing smaller berry clusters with more concentrated flavors." He had managed this block with minimal interventions specifically to preserve those qualities. He had resisted pressure, twice, from Lawrence to replant with newer high-yield varieties that would have increased total tonnage and destroyed the quality differentiation. Patricia listened carefully. 2 follow-up questions that were good questions. Then she turned to Greg Tanner. "Is this documented?" Greg said he had notes from the Derek Foss interview. She looked at Hector. "How much of this exists in writing? Most of it is in my head," he said. "That's a problem," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, but was not warm. The expression of someone doing an assessment that necessarily involved the person. "What happens to this knowledge if you're not here?" He held her gaze. "It goes with me," he said. The April visit produced decisions. Greg Tanner was confirmed as farm manager with full operational authority. Hector's role was formalized as operations coordinator. He had a title and a contract, and no authority Greg Tanner was required to respect. The compensation was fair. The title was real. The authority was not. Carl told Hector they valued his contribution and wanted him to stay. He said it in the farmhouse kitchen directly, and Hector understood that he meant it and understood what it meant in practice. They wanted what Hector knew without the complication of what Hector was. The complication was immigration status. Carl and Patricia were not bad people. They had inherited a legal and operational situation they had not created and were not equipped to resolve. Susan Park had advised them to address the I-9 liability, standard process, formal employment contracts, verification that workers had the right to work in the United States. Hector could not pass I-9 verification. This had been true for 31 years. Lawrence had operated in the informal understanding that characterized agricultural employment in the valley for decades. An understanding that worked because it was in everyone's practical interest for it to work. Carl and Patricia had inherited that understanding and the liability that came with it. Hector was the liability. He understood this. He did not blame them for understanding it the same way. What he felt was something more complicated than anger. He had given 31 years. He had given knowledge the farm could not be managed without. He had given the best work of his life to a piece of ground that would probably end up sold to a corporate operation, or converted to almonds, or divided into residential parcels. None of the legal frameworks available to him acknowledged that giving. He called Roberto. Roberto said, "This is what we prepared for." He had been preparing longer than Hector understood. Over 2 months since Lawrence's death, Roberto had been quietly building a record. Not a legal claim, something different. A documentation of the farm's operational history from Hector's perspective. The irrigation logs Hector had kept for 15 years, the soil amendment decisions, and the cover crop rotations, and the vineyard block management. The documentation of the Fresno-buyer relationship, including the quality premiums and the communications that had established the terms. The record of what the farm had been and how it had come to be what it was. Not a legal argument, a factual record. Roberto also had a contact, a woman named Diana Sandoval, who worked with the California Agricultural Workers Heritage Project, a nonprofit that documented farm worker histories and their contributions to California's agricultural economy. Diana had spent 15 years collecting exactly this kind of history. The knowledge and labor and management expertise that the official record did not capture because the official record was not built to capture it. Roberto said, "She wants to talk to you." Hector thought about it for a week. Then he called her. Diana drove from Sacramento on a Thursday. They sat at Hector's kitchen table and talked for 4 hours. She was 48, second generation. Her parents had worked the Salinas lettuce fields in the 80s. She brought a recorder and 2 notebooks, and the specific kind of listening that Hector recognized as real attention. Not the transcription attention of Derek Foss. The understanding attention of someone trying to grasp what the knowledge was, not just what it contained. He told her about the farm, the South Block drainage, the cover cropping history, the premium vineyard block, the irrigation schedule, the Fresno-buyer relationship, the decisions he had made and why and what had happened as a result. He told her about Lawrence and Doris, the trust built over years through the specific texture of daily work shared between people who had not chosen each other and had nonetheless come to depend on each other in ways that the formal structures around them did not recognize. He told her about the 1993 arrival, the phone number on a piece of paper, the county road, the first season, the reasons he had stayed. He had stayed because the land was good, and because his work on it had made things that did not exist before. He had not known that was important to him until he had it. Diana came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. Over 6 weeks she helped him build the record. Not just the operational documentation, something more. A narrative record of how the knowledge had been acquired. What Lawrence had shown him in the first years, and what he had developed on his own in the later ones, the errors and what they had taught him. The conversations with Lawrence, in which Hector's idea had been dismissed and proved right over the following seasons. The conversations in which he had been wrong, and why being wrong had taught him something he would not have learned otherwise. The record was not a legal document, not an immigration document, not a claim on the farm's assets. It was a record of what had happened on 480 acres of California soil over 31 years, told from the perspective of the person who had known it most completely. In May, the Fresno buyer came for his annual visit. Tom Nakamura, 52, second-generation Japanese-American. He had been buying table grapes from the Alderman farm for 8 years. He ran produce buying for a regional distributor whose customers were high-end grocery retailers in the Bay Area and Los Angeles. He had a reputation for knowing what he was buying and paying what it was worth. He had always dealt with Hector. Lawrence had introduced them in the early years and stepped back because the relationship required daily knowledge of the fruit that only Hector had. Tom walked the premium block with Hector. He looked at the vine development, touched the canopy, asked about the winter pruning and the irrigation deficit strategy. Hector had been running in this block for 8 years to concentrate the berry flavor. He asked about the bud break timing and what the spring weather had done to the set. Greg Tanner was present watching. At one point, Tom looked at Greg directly. "How long have you been here?" Greg said, "Since February." Tom nodded. He looked back at Hector. "The quality of this fruit," he said, "is management quality, not variety, not soil alone. The decisions made about this block over a long time by someone who understood what the block was trying to do." He paused. "I buy this fruit because of those decisions. Not the property, the decisions, Greg said he understood. Tom looked at him with the look of a man who was not certain the other man understood what he had just said. After the visit, Hector sat in the shade at the end of the premium block. He thought about what Tom had said. He had known it. Tom had known it. The fruit was worth what it was worth because of 31 years of decisions made by a man who did not legally exist on the property where he had made them. This was not unique. This was the history of California agriculture. Decisions made by men and women who did not legally exist, whose knowledge and judgment had produced the wealth of the valley, whose names were not on the deeds and not in the records. He thought about Diana's documentation, about the record they had been building. It was not enough in the legal sense, he knew that, but it was the beginning of something that did not yet have a shape. In June, Patricia called. She called, not Carl. This meant something. She said she had been thinking about what he had told her in April, the premium block, the South Block drainage. She had been reading the report Diana's organization had produced. Roberto had sent it to Susan Park as part of a conversation the two attorneys had been having about the farm's transition. She said she had also talked to Tom Nakamura. Tom had been direct with her. The premium relationship with his company depended on the management quality of the premium block. If that quality changed, he would buy at standard market rates rather than the premium rate. The difference was approximately $40,000 a year. She said, "I want to understand what it would take to preserve the management quality." Hector thought about what to say. He said, "It would take someone learning the land the way I learned it, not from a report, not from an interview. From years of being here and paying attention and making mistakes and understanding why the mistakes happened." She said, "How long would that take?" He said, "To do it right? 3 to 5 years minimum." She was quiet. He said, "I can teach someone, if there's someone to teach." She said, "Would you be willing to do that?" He thought about his 31 years, about the South Block in March, about the Premium Block in May, about the knowledge that lived in him and would die with him if there was no one to receive it. He said yes. 3 days later, Patricia called Carl. He was at his desk in Sacramento when she called. He already had the Derek Foss report open and a different agricultural broker's number on a notepad. He had been pricing the property with a colleague at the firm. The numbers were significant. The land values in Tulare County had done things in the past decade that would have surprised Lawrence Alderman. Patricia said, "I talked to Hector." Carl said, "And?" "Tom Nakamura called me $40,000 a year a problem," she said. Those were his words. He said the premium is management, not property. He said if the management changes, the premium changes. Carl was quiet. "That $40,000 doesn't come with the land if we sell," Patricia said. "It comes with Hector's knowledge of that land, which is currently inside one person with no succession plan." Hector said he would teach someone. "Yes," Patricia said. Carl looked at the broker's number on his notepad. "If we sell, we get the land value. If we keep it and build the knowledge transfer properly, we get the land value later and the operating income in the meantime." "That's the math," Patricia said. "But that's not why I'm calling." Carl waited. "I've been reading Diana Sandoval's documentation," she said. "The record she and Hector built." A pause. "Carl, he managed this farm for 30 years. Dad signed off on his decisions, but they were Hector's decisions. The premium block, the cover cropping, the Fresno relationship. That was Hector." Carl was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to do what's right," she said, "which also happens to be what makes financial sense, which is not always how these things work out." They did not sell. The process of not selling and of building the structure that made not selling possible was complicated. Roberto negotiated with Susan Park over 4 months. The immigration process was the hardest part. Roberto had been preparing for this for months, building documentation, understanding what options existed under California law and under recent federal guidance for long-term agricultural workers. He had the documentation ready, but being ready did not make it easy. The morning Hector drove to the CRLA office in Visalia to begin the formal process. He sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, the truck engine off, the valley morning warm around him. 31 years of avoiding this moment had shaped his life in ways he could not fully account for. The routes he took, the interactions he avoided, the specific quality of attention he brought to situations that other people moved through without thinking. He thought about the farm, the South Block, the Premium Block, the cover crop in the East Extension that was in its 5th year of building organic matter in soil that had been depleted before he arrived. 31 years of work that existed whether or not any piece of paper acknowledged it. He got out of the truck and went inside. The process took 4 months. Roberto walked him through every step. At the end, Hector had a work authorization, lawful, documented. Reflecting, imperfectly but legally, 31 years of contribution to an operation that the law now acknowledged for the first time. It was not a path to citizenship, which was a longer and more complicated process. Roberto was helping him begin separately. It was not a deed. What it was a beginning, a legal beginning, a piece of paper that said Hector Reyes worked here and had the right to do so. He drove back to the farm that afternoon and parked and sat for a moment looking at the South Block, the vines in their rows, the soil color he could read, the way he read weather, the place he had known completely for 30 years. Then he went to find Marcus. The person Patricia had identified to learn the farm was a young man named Marcus Webb, 26, from Hanford, the son of a farm worker family. College educated in agricultural science at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, he had come through Diana Sandoval's network, smart, careful, and he had the quality Hector recognized immediately. He listened to the land before he talked about the land. Hector started teaching him in September, not through formal instruction. The way Lawrence had taught Hector, through being present with the work, through talking while the work was happening, through making mistakes on the ground and understanding them on the ground. He took Marcus to the South Block first. He showed him the drainage pattern. He showed him how to read the soil color at 6 in the morning and what different colors meant for the day's irrigation decisions. He explained the relationship between the cover crop composition and the soil moisture retention, and why the cover crop selection had changed 3 times in 20 years. Marcus wrote things down, but he also did what Hector watched for. After he wrote things down, he put the notebook away and just looked. He looked at the soil and the vines the way you looked at something you were trying to understand, rather than something you were trying to record. In October, Hector took him to the Premium Block. He told him the history, not just the management decisions, but the context for each decision, the conditions that had made each decision right. What would have been lost if a different decision had been made? He told him about the replanting conversations with Lawrence, about the deficit irrigation strategy, and the 8 years it had taken to calibrate to this block's specific behavior. Marcus listened for 3 hours without interrupting. At the end, he said, "You've been doing this for 31 years. "Yes," Hector said, "and now you're giving it to me." Hector looked at the vines, the October light going horizontal and gold, making visible things the vertical summer sun had flattened. The Premium Block in the late afternoon looked like what it was. Not a commercial field. A place that had been understood and tended by the specific attention of someone who had decided to know it completely. "I'm giving you what I can," Hector said. What I can't give you is the years. The years are what make it real. You'll have to earn those yourself." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why are you doing this? You could keep this knowledge and use it as leverage. That's what you've been doing." Hector thought about that. "Because leverage is not the same as standing," he said. "I learned that this year." He looked at the vines. "What I know about this land, the drainage, the soil, the fruit quality, it's not mine because I know it. It's mine because I built it. And things you build don't stay yours by keeping them secret. They stay yours by passing them on." Marcus looked at the premium block for a long time. Then he said, "What do you want in return?" Hector said, "I want the farm to be okay." It was the same answer he had given Roberto at the beginning. It meant the same thing it had always meant. It also meant something more now. Greg Tanner left in December. He came to find Hector the morning before his last day. He stood at the edge of the south block and looked at the vines for a moment. Then he said, "I would have let this block stress in March." Hector said nothing. "I wouldn't have known what I was looking at," Greg said. "I knew it then, and I let the data override what I didn't know." He looked at Hector. "That's a bad habit," Hector said. "It is." Greg nodded once and walked back to the farmhouse to finish his paperwork. He was gone by noon. Carl thanked him for his service. The thank you was genuine and insufficient, and both of them knew it. The harvest that December was the best premium block harvest in 4 years. Tom Nakamura graded it at the highest quality rating his company used. He paid the premium. He called Patricia directly to tell her, which he had not done before. Patricia called Hector after she hung up with Tom. She said, "I owe you something." Hector said, "You don't." "I do," she said. "Not a number. I don't know what the number would be. But something." She paused. "I've been thinking about what Diana's documentation said. What you built here over 30 years. My father benefited from it every year. I benefited from it every year. We had no idea." Hector was quiet. "He knew," Patricia said. "I think he knew, and he didn't know how to address it, and then he ran out of time." "He was a fair man," Hector said, "within what he understood." "Yes," she said, "within what he understood." A pause. "I want to do better than that." In February, Hector watched Marcus crouching in the south block in the early morning, feeling the soil before the day's first irrigation, then standing up and making the schedule adjustment that the soil condition called for. Not the adjustment the CIMIS data would suggest. The adjustment this specific drainage pattern and this specific soil type and this specific point in the season required. Hector had not told him to make that adjustment. Marcus had seen it himself. Hector watched him from the headland and said nothing. He went to check the premium block. The vines dormant under winter pruning. The work of the last season complete and the work of the next beginning. He walked the rows and looked at the pruning cuts and at the soil and at the way the block settled into the February morning. He had built this. Not the land. You did not build land, but the understanding of it. The specific knowledge of what it needed and when and why. The relationships that gave the knowledge value in the market. The document that now existed in Diana Sandoval's archive, and in the files of 3 universities that had requested copies, and in the legal record that Roberto had built. The law had not recorded what Hector Reyes built on 480 acres of California soil. The deed did not include his name. It probably never would. But the south block drained correctly. The premium block set fruit at the quality Tom Nakamura paid for. The cover crop in the east section was completing its 5th year of building organic matter in soil that had been depleted before Hector arrived. Marcus was in the south block at 6 in the morning, reading the soil the way Hector had taught him to read it, making the judgment the land required. The land remembered what it had been taught. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the thing. Hector walked back from the premium block toward the farmhouse to start the day's work. The February morning was cold and clear. The valley stretched out around him in the early light, flat and immense, the mountains visible to the east and west, and somewhere, in the miles of vineyard and strawberry fields, the small daily decisions being made by the people who understood what the land needed. He had been one of those people for 31 years. He intended to be one for a few more.